Okay, and now let's get on with the seminar. So it is my great privilege to introduce you first to Lenita Conradi. She's a Methodist minister in the Harrow and Hillingdon circuit. Lenita has recently completed her professional doctorate in practical theology at Chester University with her thesis, How Could the British Methodist Church Preach More Effectively on Domestic Abuse as Part of its Prophetic Witness? And her paper will focus on domestic violence in the Methodist Church and the practice of preaching on the topic. So Lenita, I will stop sharing my screen here and off you go.
Am I muted?
No, we can hear you.
We can hear you. Well, thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity to present this paper. In 2005, the Methodist Church released a comprehensive report regarding domestic abuse. Amongst others, the theological section of this report contained the phrase that recurred that the church needs to have its prophetic voice heard, or that it must exercise its prophetic witness. And it was this phrase, prophetic witness, which caught my attention and led me to the thesis title, which you have already heard. It raised the question about what prophetic witness was, and also whether Methodist preachers preach on domestic abuse, and if they do not, then why not? I use the term domestic abuse because it is more comprehensive than simply domestic violence, as much domestic abuse does not necessarily involve violence. I also use the term mainly to talk about women abusing men, even at least men abusing women, even though the other way around also happens. But the majority of domestic abuse cases are women who are abused by men. I'll first look then briefly at what prophetic witness means before I deal with what it means to break the silence on domestic abuse. Now, the church's prophetic witness derives from biblical prophecy, which we find both in the Hebrew scriptures and also in the New Testament. And essentially, the prophets were representing a God who cares for the poor, the oppressed, and the afflicted. And even though the prophetic books have some difficulties for feminists in some of the metaphors that the prophets use, one cannot simply discount them all. The prophets, in the way that they spoke, created what Walter Brueggemann calls a prophetic imagination. And essentially, this means to imagine a world in which God as Trinity is a real person and an effective agent. And prophetic proclamation is a staging and performance of a context between two narrative accounts of the world, the dominant narrative and the Yahweh narrative. So the dominant narrative, amongst others, is a narrative of violence, whereas the Yahweh narrative is a world of non-violence. A practical example of the prophetic imagination would be Martin Luther King's notion of I have a dream. And ultimately, the prophetic imagination imagines new possibilities. But how could we give voice to this prophetic imagination? But before I get to that, I first need to talk about the fact that the church has, by and large, remained silent on the topic of domestic abuse. This is borne out by the responses of my participants as to why they are hesitant to preach on the topic, though they acknowledge its importance. And it's also borne out by the literature and a study conducted in the USA among Catholic priests, which dealt with how to approach spousal abuse, but also talked about preaching. The dominant narrative is that patriarchy is at the heart of domestic abuse. And it is only in the last 50 years or so that denominations have been ordaining women to the ministry. In addition, women's voices have not been heard in biblical interpretation and exegesis for the vast majority of the history of the church. Women have been silent about domestic abuse for fear of not being believed. As Rietbond Storm, a Dutch theologian, talks about in her book, The Incredible Woman, that is the woman who is not believed. Silencing women is not the only thing that the church has done. It has been silent from the pulpit by its hesitation or reluctance to preach on the subject. It is a sensitive issue, and no doubt people feel very uncomfortable about preaching on it. But research suggests that this silence could be as a result of a denial that domestic abuse happens in the church, and in any event, many see it as someone else's problem. There is a notion that if domestic abuse was a problem, why has the pastor never mentioned it? Others may think that women must have deserved what was happening to them, and why didn't they simply leave their partners if it was that bad? And there were those who wonder whether talking about domestic abuse in the church would stop such violence. A recognition and concern regarding the church's silence on domestic abuse was highlighted in a book of essays by John McClure and Nancy Ramsey. They advocate the fact that the reason for the silence is because of a denial of domestic abuse, but also that pastors may be afraid that their image in the community may be tarnished if they preach on such topic. They say that silence is not only an absence of speech, the silence communicates a negative message to victims, perpetrators, and bystanders. To victims that they are alone in their suffering, to perpetrators that the church doesn't hold them accountable for their evil deeds, and to bystanders that it's okay to remain on the sidelines of a brutal and sometimes deadly game. And so therefore, the silence could, in a sense, be tantamount to complicity with violence or a general lack of awareness and even an indifference. There are several reasons why preachers hesitate to preach on domestic abuse. There are pastoral issues which preachers may not be able to follow up. There is an anxiety of upsetting the congregation. It could be construed as interfering in people's lives. It's recognized that the worship service needs to cater for different people. And perhaps domestic abuse may be outside the lived experience of many congregations. There is also a feeling of inadequacy among preachers for not feeling qualified to preach on the subject. And just recently, in a suggestion to my own circuit colleagues that we should mark Domestic Violence Sunday on 21 November with a church service, I was met with a silence and some kind of comment about, oh, well, it's probably better dealt with in small groups. I mentioned in brackets that I will be preaching on domestic abuse on the 21st of November. Now, I am not unsympathetic to the reasons for the silence, nor am I judgmental, but I do not believe that the obstacles are insurmountable. How might one break the silence? My participants, even though they were hesitant, did recognize that preaching on domestic abuse was important, because it's important to know that the church connects with people's lived experience and also to show that the church cares. I am not suggesting that preaching domestic abuse from the pulpit is going to be a magic solution, nor am I suggesting that the preacher simply bulldoze her way in, because that is not how the biblical prophets operated. But breaking the silence means breaking the silence of the preacher and the person in the pew, listening to different voices. One way in which we might preach on such radical evils is by viewing preaching in terms of what Christine Smith calls weeping, confession, and resistance. But as I hope to demonstrate, I have taken the view that lament, truth-telling, and resistance are a much broader concept. It's not the only model, but I'm suggesting it may be one way in which we can give voice to the prophetic imagination, challenging the dominant narrative. All three parts of the triad form part of this alternative narrative. And so I give a brief overview of each of these. First of all, preaching as lament. Suffering and lament are part of everyday life, but the church has by and large neglected the practice of lament. A search of Singing the Faith, the latest Methodist hymn book, reveals very few, if any, songs of lament. There are many who seem to think that if we say that we believe in God, we are to praise God in all things, and that nothing can separate from God's love, and that lament may be perceived as a lack of faith. But this is not realistic, because the world in which we live is a world of disorientation and disequilibrium. Instead of seeing a lack of lament as a sign of faith, it is more likely a denial of reality or wishful optimism, and a notion that people of faith should not embrace negativity. The current dominant narrative is one, in the words of Brueggemann, which rushes past loss and confident recovery, according to a tight ideology of success. In other words, we live in a culture where financial security and success count a great deal, and grief and loss could be seen as a sign of failure or vulnerability, something which we don't want to admit. And yet the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament contain multiple examples of lament, which come from a people who saw themselves elected by Yahweh and in a covenant relationship. And as long as they observed the covenant, they surely deserved something better than their present torment. There was a feeling of entitlement to better things, and this was the basis for the practice of lament. The New Testament may have fewer examples of lament, but it is certainly there. Stephen Lacus asserts that if the lament of the churches connects with the destructive forces of oppression and injustice, it may then stand in a long tradition of biblical lament and align itself to and with the work of Christ. But what could lament be defined as? It is a response of the one who suffers, but the one who laments may also be responding to the suffering of others. So lamenting is not mere whining, nor does it necessarily mean that the lamenter has resigned herself to a situation. Instead, lament can be seen as coming from someone who has not been silenced, but who is putting up a fight, refusing to fall silent. It could even be a form of revolt. And there are many examples of lament in the Bible. Lament in the Psalms recognize suffering and plead with God for God to do something, but it also signifies a relationship with God, trusting that God can do something. Lament also contains complaint to God, even holding God responsible for our situation. But lament in the Bible always happens within the boundaries of faith. It is a crying out against God, anger against God, puzzlement with the situation, but also recognize that God is present. Lament is also seen in Jesus' cry from the cross when he felt forsaken by God. This was a desperate cry of loneliness, perhaps even an accusation. And it is a cry with which many could identify, those who suffer domestic abuse or other difficult situations. The God of the Hebrew Bible becomes the God who suffers. But why would lament be important? Lament does not need to be done for its own sake. It is not merely ranting and raving. It is an expression of how we feel, as the way in which the psalmist did it. The Psalms can give voice to our own grief and suffering. We could find our own voice, our own cries to God through the Psalms of lament. Lament allows people to articulate their grief and anguish. That was why people lamented in the old days, in the Bible. The lament as an expression of deep sorrow, pain, and anguish can also be part of the start of the healing process. To lament implies to search for new orienting clues, allowing a proper response to what has happened without denying its demand. But lament is also done in a community. Denise Ackerman, a South African feminist theologian, speaks about the way in which communal lament and where victims and perpetrators lament together on the road to hope and healing, confronting the pain, letting go of the bitterness, and leading to new hope. This form of lament, as is the case with biblical lament, is not a one-off outburst, but a process. But practicing lament also allows other voices to be heard. So, for example, Christians need to read Lamentations not only as reflecting their own suffering, but more importantly, that the book speaks of the brutal violence of the nations against Israel, and it is sobering for Gentile Christians to read the text not from the point of suffering Israel, but in the role of the oppressive nations. Read in this way, the book serves to invite the communities that have persecuted Israel to listen to the voices of their victims. And so therefore, in this whole process of lament, other voices are being heard. We are lamenting together, but also expressing our solidarity. Christine Smith says that we weep when we're alive to those things that we cherish and value, and are touched by something that we can hardly name or utter. So in acts of preaching, those who preach need to engage their deepest passions, their highest values, their surest convictions, and make many present and alive in moments of proclamation. And this is not just weeping, but may include sighing and groaning. The next part of the triad is the whole question of truth-telling. Because simply lamenting is not enough. The truth about domestic abuse must be told. And part of telling this truth is by dispelling some of the myths surrounding domestic abuse. For example, the myth that it affects only a small percentage of the population. If domestic abuse is not limited to a certain class of women or men, nor does it have much to do with a woman's or man's education. The myth that it is easy for an abused woman to leave her home. But research suggests that abuse occurs across the board. Myths could be an excuse for not addressing the issues. And Al Miles, when writing about how to involve men in trying to combat domestic abuse, points out that men need to be taught and that women do not cause domestic abuse. Yet it has been his experience that when leading courses for men, that they insist that the woman must have done something which provoked a man to abuse her. There are men who believe that they have a right to force themselves sexually upon their wives and girlfriends. Many men rely on the Bible for their attitudes towards their wives or partners. Domestic abuse can never be justified. And if preaching is there to bring about transformation, that needs to be stressed. But at the heart of the reality of domestic abuse is misogyny, hatred of women, but also patriarchy. Male domination means subordination of women. And this is the truth that preachers need to confront. The problem lies in patriarchy, which is even more broad than misogyny. It means sustaining and perpetuating male control over females. And in order to maintain such control, men often resort to violence. Such control results in men having power over women, thereby creating a hierarchical relationship. Men's justification for violence against women is as a result of the patriarchal nature of biblical writings, which emanate from a patriarchal worldview. The exclusion or oppression of women and other marital and other marginalized groups may not necessarily have been in the intention of the biblical authors. They simply reflected their culture. And Carol Fontaine puts it well when she says that the Bible is the heir of patriarchy, not its originator. But even if one was to accept that patriarchy was part of the worldview of that time and culture, one cannot hide behind the culture and condone patriarchy. We also bear in mind that those who compiled the biblical canon were men. Men have a privileged position in a patriarchal society, and they want to preserve this dominant position and continue to control women by using violence. But apart from patriarchy, it's also necessary to acknowledge that domestic abuse is a sin, and it needs to be named as such. And when we use the word sin, we mean estrangement, alienation, which is contrary to God's created order and contradicts God's intention for our life. Exposing the reality of telling the truth about domestic violence as in cause and its causes is an important step towards trying to bring about a society where these realities no longer play such a significant role. Preaching as resistance. Resistance goes beyond lament and truth-telling, even though there is a certain overlap between the latter two. Truth-telling is not only about statistics. It's not only about stating facts. It needs to be much more than that. It takes a stand against evil, and it must be proclaimed in such a way that it mobilizes a community into action. Such resistance can take various forms. Truth-telling in itself is resistance. But it goes much further than that. It goes beyond preaching and hearing good news, and it amounts to being good news. Christine Smith calls this God's redemptive act, which involves opposing evil forces and working with those who seek change. Justice is the watchword. Preaching as resistance is also recognized in other circles. In 2018, Phil Snyder published a book under his editorship, Preaching as Resistance in the Wake of Trump's America. And much of what he says mirrors the approach of Christine Smith and also that of Brueggemann. It names the present realities, but it's also an invitation to experience another reality, naming the reality of domestic abuse and inviting hearers to imagine a world in which that reality is no longer there. He uses, thus Phil Snyder, an all-inclusive word called the kingdom of God, spelled K-I-N-D-O-M. It counters the present reality of dominance, subjugation, and brute power by emphasizing Christ's saving work of justice, solidarity, and love. There must be resistance to dominant power structures in order to make room for the transforming realm of God. Such preaching may not change the minds of those in power. Instead, it creates a sense of community and solidarity with those crushed by such power. The main aim of resistance preaching is to name the evil and to create a climate in which there is both solidarity and hope that the present situation could change. Preaching as resistance does not contain a magic formula which will change everything in an instant, but simply ignoring the evils in the world, the evils of domestic abuse could be seen as an indirect form of collusion. Preaching as resistance enables listeners to experience a new mode of being rooted in Christ's saving work. Christ ushered in a new era by creating and associating with people on the margins. Phil Snyder says that the sermon is the entry point which could cause hearers to long for the kingdom of God and to spur them into action in order to bring it about. Preaching is not an end in itself. It is one medium among many others. The hard work of marching, protesting, demonstrating, and forging community must accompany the hard work of preaching. But preaching as lament, truth-telling, and resistance are not merely useful metaphors. They should form part of a homiletical methodology. And this involves constructing sermons in such a way that listeners experience form of oppression by the language and illustrations preachers use, and also by telling the truth of oppression. Then there needs to be invitation to respond. Contemporary preaching needs to be an expression of our redemptive activity in the world. It's about trying to bring about a world free from violence and other evils. If a preacher wants listeners to envision new possibilities, such ideas are not abstract. One cannot be neutral about injustice. There must be passion which will stir the minds and hearts of listeners. This requires listeners to enter into the passion of the preaching. A preacher cannot be neutral about domestic abuse. She needs to empower her listeners also to be angry about domestic abuse. And this requires courage. Jesus fearlessly denounced oppression. Contemporary preachers need to follow that example. I deal now briefly with some principles relating to preaching as resistance against domestic abuse, only just to hone in what I've said before. Preachers need not only to tell the truth about patriarchy, but to make both women and men aware of the fact that men objectify women by using them as objects to manipulate at will. This worldview of male objectification needs to be deconstructed. In addition, women and men need to be made aware of what Smith sees as the way in which women become male identified under male supremacy. I see this as women needing to be encouraged to break the silence. Moreover, male identification causes women automatically to acknowledge male authority, actions, and words. Many women choose this in order to survive and protect themselves from violence. Preachers need to be made aware of both objectification and male identification in order to resist these evils from the pulpit. This would include imagining a new world where there is gender equality, not only on the statute book, but also in practice. This would be a part of the prophetic imagination of contemporary prophetic preachers. Preachers need to stop denying the prevalence of domestic abuse and to confront it from the pulpit. The church has traditionally viewed the sanctity of marriage within a narrow understanding of family life. And the preacher, in resisting domestic abuse, also needs to paint new pictures of what marriage could be about, not only when in situations where men dominate women.
And I'm sorry to be horrible here, Lidita, this is now your 5-minute warning, though I could happily listen to you for the next 3 hours, so feel free to go.
Okay, so have I got 5 minutes left then?
Oh yeah, absolutely, you do.
Okay, I will just then briefly talk about the preaching as resistance, was preaching against resistance against patriarchy and violence. Now Becca, my co-presenter, is going to talk about violence. I just want to briefly talk about resisting patriarchy, and this is just going to be very brief, and I'll try and summarize it as best I can. I see that central to the act of preaching is the use of scripture. And while there may be other models, I suggest that a feminist hermeneutic might be an effective way in which to resist the dominant narrative of patriarchy and violence and open up new horizons for more inclusive and liberatory readings. On the face of it, the Bible promotes patriarchy and power, as we've already seen. Feminist theologians propose that the Bible be read in such a way that patriarchy and power are unmasked. This cannot be done simply by focusing on texts which deal with selected biblical women. Instead, as mentioned previously, it needs to be recognized that patriarchy is a system of power relations between men and women determined by particular constructions of masculinity and femininity. And one approach would be to employ Schussler Fiorenza's fourfold hermeneutic, a hermeneutics of suspicion, proclamation, remembrance, and creative actualization, which enables preachers both to challenge and reclaim patriarchal texts in order to preach more effectively against domestic abuse. And I will just give some introductory remarks, because I'm not going to have time to elaborate on the fourfold hermeneutic. But her introductory remarks are very important. She sees, does Schussler Fiorenza, the purpose of feminist theology as advocacy and liberation. And a broad view of patriarchy is a pyramidal system and hierarchical structure of society and church in which women's oppression is specified not only in terms of race and class, but also in terms of marital status. And then she uses something which I find extremely useful, and I will leave it at that after I've talked about this. She said you could view the Bible either as a mythical archetype or as a historical prototype, particularly. And so the Bible has been traditionally interpreted, and if the Bible is a mythical archetype, it is universal for all time and must be accepted as patriarchal, androcentric, and dominated by a male God. In this view of the Bible, it is normative and authoritative for all times and all cultures, and should either be wholly accepted by feminists or rejected out of hand. This view of the Bible is a part of the dominant narrative of many preachers. But the Bible as an historical prototype allows revelations to be an ongoing process. This approach does not seek to identify with certain biblical texts and traditions, but rather solidarity with women and biblical religions. Women can then make connections between their own struggles, historical struggles of women, and thereby develop a vision for the future. The Bible is then no longer something to obey or submit to uncritically. It involves a critical interpretation of biblical texts and then makes connections between such texts and the present situation of women. It is from this basis that she proposes this fourfold hermeneutic. Now, in this paper, I have tried to show that it is important for the church to break the silence on domestic abuse, and I have suggested that one way of doing that is by viewing preaching as lament, as truth-telling, and as resistance to patriarchy and violence, and that will be what my co-presenter will focus on. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lenita, for that absolutely excellent paper. As I said, I would have happily listened to you for the next 3 hours, but I might just get fired if I do that. But thank you so much. There are plenty of questions, and it is at this point I will pass this on to my lovely co-host, Holly. Feel free to take it away with the questions.
Hi folks, yeah, thanks Lenita, what a fabulous paper. So I'm just going to be the mouthpiece for the questions that have come through on the comments. The first question is, would you need to learn to lament, especially if you do not know what it involves?
Yes, I think that would be part of it, because I think lament has been so neglected. I think it's something that people don't know about and actually shy away from, because we in the church are kind of, and I mean, I'm obviously speaking particularly of lament in the context of worship and preaching. I think that it's important for us to learn to lament, and I think if you look at the world in which we live at the moment, especially last year with all the loss and grief, I think that lament is part of what that healing process will. Yes, and so I think in a way, I guess teaching people to lament would be important.
Yeah, that's a really interesting response, particularly in kind of current context, but more broadly, obviously very relevant and significant. I'll move on swiftly because obviously we've got limited time in terms of questions. We want to be able to cover everybody's. The next one is, in order to remove the grounding for hegemonic patriarchy, do preachers need to confront the idea of God as patriarch and encourage a re-engagement with the divine feminine?
Yes, I would say that preachers need themselves, because I think before you can even try and get a congregation to do that, preachers themselves need to re-engage with God, not only as the divine feminine, but a whole lot more than that. And I mean, I think the literature talks about a whole lot of different models which are used by Rosemary Radford Ruther and Sally MacFaig, in that God is much more than either possibly even masculine or feminine, yes, but that God is only male, then in a way assumes, as somebody put it, if God is male, then male is God. So yes, engaging with God on a different level, I think is really important.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, and there are definitely some fascinating resources for that, both in terms of scholarship, but also in biblical literature and tradition. Okay, so the next question for you, Lenita. What would be the key life application points to present to the congregation when preaching on domestic violence?
I think one could first of all tell or use, well, an example of a passage and preach on it. And I don't want to steal Becca's thunder, because she'll be talking about Judges 19, which featured in my thesis as well, but I won't go to Judges 19. But I think one's got to tell the story, and then you've got to try and get people to identify with the story, and then to talk about how does this story speak to us today. So, for example, if you look at the story of Tamar in 2 Samuel, which is the one I'll be preaching on the 21st of November, and trying to understand who are the Tamars of the world today, where the whole thing of Tamar's rape was hushed up, and King David didn't do anything about it. And so how do we, and then what is the good news in that? Well, the good news is that God does care, but also that we need to try and bring out the voices of those people and make people more aware of the fact that the things that we read about in the Bible are still happening today. I don't know that that's a particularly adequate answer, but I think, and I think if we looked in more detail at Schüssler Fiorenza's fourfold hermeneutic, I think that there is material in there which I think preachers could use, which would paint a different picture of what the world could be like. I don't know if that really answers the question, but that's as far as I can take it at the moment.
Great, thank you. And also, of course, we've got time for questions after Becca's paper and at the very end. So it might be an issue that kind of comes back, once that conversation's kind of been taken, to the next step with Becca's paper. Okay, so we've got 2 more questions at the moment. Please do feel free to carry on putting questions in the chat, folks in the room, because we've got a little bit of time. So the next question is, there will be children in the congregation. How do you style the preaching appropriately on domestic violence, taking into account that children will be listening?
I suppose my cynical comment to that is, if you've got children congregation, praise God. I don't know where they came from. I'm not really sure. I think I would have to probably think about that one and try and either perhaps I think that possibly it may not be appropriate for children to be there, but I think it would also depend on how old they are. If they were teenagers, I would think that sort of thing would connect with them, because people are exposed to so much these days. Teenagers know what's going on in the world. So I think it would depend on the age of the children as to how I would actually go about trying to address that in their presence.
Great, thank you. And one more, if I happen to have missed anybody's question by getting kind of lost in the chat, I think I've managed to cover everybody, but if not, do repost it if you feel that I've not come to your question. I've just got one more on my record of the question, so if I have missed you, please do put it back into the chat. The next question is, if a church does not currently have resources to deal with domestic abuse, so no one is trained in the issue, for example, how would you begin to put those resources in place before starting to preach on domestic violence?
No, not necessarily, because I think I'm not really sure that it's a prerequisite, because I think there are other sensitive issues on which we preach. And also I think it needs to be said that the Methodist Church is pretty strict and clued up on safeguarding. So there are people in the church that are trained in general safeguarding issues. And I now, if I do preach on the subject, since I've written my thesis, will always make sure that I introduce the sermon by saying, if there are pastoral issues that arise, please talk to me afterwards. So I don't think that the fact that you may not be people trained in the church to deal with it as such, I don't think that should preclude one from preaching on it. Because while I get that to some extent, I think that there's a danger in all of these things that we could become so hung up about that we end up never talking about it. And so I think that one sometimes has got to take a risk. And I certainly think that I am prepared to take that risk, not being insensitive to the difficulties, but at the same time, I am prepared to take the risk, because I do believe that that is part of what I need to do as a contemporary prophetic preacher.
Great, thank you. We've got one more question that's come in, which I guess you've started to sort of speak about in terms of your own practice, but are there any other examples of where this is being done well already?
I don't know. I'm not sure. Because I think I'm not sure how much of that is done in the Methodist Church, even though there is a Sunday designated for that. I'm not sure what other examples that is beyond the scope of the research that I've done. So I'm afraid I can't answer that question.
Well, then I would thank you, Lenita, again for that absolutely excellent paper, and we shall come back to you, so don't get too comfortable. we shall come back to you a little later on, but yes, thank you so much. Absolutely brilliant paper. And now then, it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to our second presenter, Becca Legg. Becca is the CEO of Restored, a Christian charity with a mission to speak up about violence against women and equip the church to stand against domestic abuse and support survivors. And her talk will focus on the Levite's concubine in Judges 19. And this is kind of funny, only in inverted commas. I just happen to be teaching on this passage today. That was not by design, so I'm really interested to hear what you're going to say. And she's going to then talk about constructing a sermon on this difficult passage. She will also talk about how her research on the passage has affected her current practice. So take it away, Becca. Looking forward to this.
Thank you. And Lisa, thank you. And I just want to get engaged in all those questions. There's such good questions, but I shall stick to talking about Judges 19 for now, because the stories like the one we find in Judges 19, in fact, let me turn my PowerPoint on, then you don't have to look at my face. 1 second. Okay, let me share, else I'll get this all in the wrong direction. Hold on. There we are. Okay, I press that. Now, has that worked? Can you see my slides? Does that work? Hurrah, I shall continue. So stories like the one we find in Judges 19 are largely ignored in the pulpit. The whole book of Judges is represented just once in the 3-year lectionary cycle of the Old Testament. And I'm yet to find someone who's heard a sermon that I haven't given on the chapter. And it's not surprising. It's a story of a husband who at best is neglectful, of grotesque abuse and a horrifying murder. And yet Clinton McCann argues that these stories are actually some of the most timely and relevant of all the stories in the Old Testament. I've lost myself, hold on. Of all the themes of the role of women, spousal abuse, senseless, excessive violence, excessive individualism, moral confusion and social chaos that we find could just as easily characterize the world we live in as the world in which the stories are set. Now, a number of years ago, I chose this topic as the basis for my master's dissertation. How can we preach on these tales of terror in an age of Me Too? And when I spoke to a church friend who was a leader, his answer was simple and to the point. He said, you can't. These stories just need to be avoided. Partly because of children in the congregation, but I wasn't deterred, and actually I totally disagree. These stories do need telling, now more than ever. We live in a world where violence against women has dominated the headlines all year, from the murders of Sarah Everard and Sabina Nessa, through statistics that show us that 97% of young women will be sexually harassed, Ofsted reports that schools have a rape culture, and the rise of women sharing their stories of harassment and abuse. We simply can't get away from the realities of violence against women and girls in this time and place. The story of the Levite and his concubine is as relevant now as it was 3,000 years ago. Now, I shan't go into the full exegesis of the chapter, we don't have time for that, but it is worth noting that there is dispute about the historicity of the story, as well as the author and their intent. What is clear, however, is that the book clearly documents the consequences of a world without God, a world without godly leadership, and a descent into darkness. And the story of the Levite's concubine sits at the bottom of this godless pit. Now, whether Judges was written to promote David, Josiah, Rehoboam, or just kingship in general, whether the story in chapter 19 is written to tarnish the reputation and standing of the Ephraimites, to simply inaccurately chronicle history, or both, it remains a depiction of degradation regarded by the author as the lowest form of behaviour, the worst of mankind, the most heinous abuse of women, and the result of an individualistic culture which did what it saw fit. Now, this story documents the loss of agency of a nameless woman. The scene is set with a man, a Levite, who would have held considerable status as a man of God, respected in society. She, by contrast, is not even a proper wife, but a concubine. Despite this, she starts with considerable agency. As she chooses to leave her husband, it's exceptional that in that time and space, she should be able to make such a bold decision. She finds shelter in her father's house and for a number of months is safe. Though when her husband follows her finally to win back her heart, her story begins to change. We never actually see him so much as speak to her. Instead, we see a bizarre extended exchange, which I could go into, but I won't, between father and son-in-law, resulting in the father eventually releasing his daughter back into the care of the Levite. And the pair don't make it home before nightfall and get taken in by a stranger who doesn't consider the streets safe enough for them to remain there after nightfall. An interesting comparison, perhaps, with the Reclaiming Our Streets campaigns of this year. So far, so good. But as the group sit to share a meal, there's a banging on the door, and the men of the city, described as wicked, demand that the Levite is sent out for them to have sex with him. The host appropriately forbids such vile treatment of his guest, but in an about turn offers the women of the house instead. His daughter is saved only because the Levite so quickly forces his concubine out of the door and closes it behind her. And the Bible mercifully doesn't go into graphic detail of what happens next. But it's enough to know that this woman is abused and raped all night long until at daybreak, she's left for dead on the doorstep of the house that the Levite has been sleeping in. And in a peculiar display of outrage, he then takes her home, cuts her up into 12 pieces and sends her out to the 12 tribes of Israel in bloody packages. It's an extraordinary tale, and it's a horrible tale, but it's one that must be told. Indeed, the story actually finishes with the people of Israel coming together and saying, we must do something, so speak up. Now, whilst I don't want to get into an entire exegesis of the story, there is one phrase that is worth another look. You see, the story, as I said, begins with a woman leaving the Levite, but depending on your version of the Bible, this is ascribed to very different reasons. The NRSV says that he angered her. The NIV says that she was unfaithful. The King James says that she was a whore. There are extraordinary differences which need exploring. You see, being angry with your husband is a very different story to being a prostitute. One begins the story with a wronged wife, the other with a wrong wife. One is the victim of an unkind husband. The other is set up to have brought a traumatic fate upon herself. Going back to the church fathers, Ambrose described Judges as a story of deplorable behaviours, ending with a Levite and his concubine who, offended by her husband's chiding, returns to her father's house. Isabel Hamley documents the changing views on this translation, showing that it wasn't really until the Reformation that commentators like Martin Bucer claimed that the woman is guilty as an adulteress, and when her husband and father fail to punish her, she meets divine punishment instead. Quite a difference. The interpretive problem lies in the variations found in the Masoretic Hebrew and the Greek Septuagint. The Greek suggests that the concubine has been angered, whereas the Masoretic text reads that she became a prostitute or that she was unfaithful to him. Now, without going into all the Greek and Hebrew, the idea that she literally had illicit sex with other men is interpretively problematic. Legally, if the concubine were guilty of adultery, let alone prostitution, she would, under Levitical law, be worthy of stoning. It makes no sense then for the Levite to expend so much time and energy in going to retrieve her, and less sense still that her father would have received her in the first place, along with the shame she'd bring on the family. The translation is problematic, but essentially it only really makes contextual sense for the concubine to have left because she was angered. Somewhere in history, it became more convenient to make her fate her fault. I'll come back to that a little bit later. Now, this clarion call to consider the challenge of the story within it must be the focus of the sermon. The call to speak up and to do something about the plight of the concubine exhorts us to take this story as a cautionary tale, to live differently and create a different culture. But if we only use this story as a moral tale, we miss the point. Graham Goldsworthy writes, if we constantly tell people that what they should do to get their lives in order, we place a terrible legalistic burden upon them, and we do it at the expense of the gospel of grace. Preaching Christ and connecting this story to the gospel is critical to this sermon, as well as meeting that particular challenge that we find in Judges 19, verse 30. Now, Charles Spurgeon famously said, preach Christ always and everywhere, but Ralph gives quite a sensible note of caution, writing that actually, I don't honour Christ by forcing him into text where he isn't. And I want to take a moment to explore just how it is possible to move from a text in which God doesn't make an appearance to a sermon that shows just where this story fits into God's great story. So, Sidney Greidanus has outlined 6 key ways that we can find Christ in the Old Testament. And the first of those is redemptive historical progression. It links Jesus to the Old Testament redemptive events. So, for example, Luke's genealogy of Jesus reaches back in redemptive history to Adam, who gave into temptation and brought death into the world, and then follows it in the next chapter with a story of Jesus resisting temptation before going on to bring new life to the world. Now, it could be possible to use the story of the Levite and his concubine to show a progression in how this priest treated his woman and how Jesus treated the women that he met and spoke with. But the second way that we can do that is through promise fulfillment, which is a bit of a continuation of what we've just talked about. And essentially, this is looking at where Jesus fulfills the promises given to the people of Israel. There isn't really opportunity for this with Judges 19. The third way that we could find Jesus is through typology, which also works within redemptive historical progression. And we see God acting in regular patterns throughout history. Jesus uses typology himself to explain who he is, drawing parallels between his life and Jonah or Moses, for example. We have to be careful with this, but I'll come back to this a little bit later. Analogy looks at similarities between the Old Testament and the New. For example, in the Old Testament, Israel's portrayed as the bride of Yahweh. And in the New, Paul refers to the church as the bride of Christ. The fifth way is longitudinal themes. And Bright asserts that everywhere the New Testament seizes hold of the key themes of the Old and gives them new meaning in Christ. And the themes are often easy to find. Redemption weaves its way through the meta-narrative of the Bible, from the moment Adam and Eve rebel against God, through the redemptive sacrifice of Jesus on the cross, to the creation of a new world in need not just of a king, but the king. And it's evident in our story, and it should be emphasized. Again, I'll come back to this one. The sixth way we can find Jesus is through contrast. Sometimes the links between the Old Testament are not about similarities, but major differences. In our story, the actions of the Levite, the townsman, and the old men of Gibeah all provide a stark contrast to the way of living that Jesus preached about in the Sermon on the Mount and demonstrated on the cross. My PowerPoint has just died. I might just keep talking to you if that's okay. So for now, I'm going to keep focusing on typology. So there's a number of different ways that have been suggested that we could do this with Judges 19. And the first of that is where we see the woman as Israel, the bride of God. So she can perhaps be seen to do this. Nicholas Ansell asserts that the fact that the unnamed woman represents Israel is made appallingly clear in the way she's cut into 12 pieces to be sent to the 12 tribes. Klein compares the concubine and Achsah, arguing that both can be seen as a representation of Israel as the bride or wife of God. He contrasts Achsah, who we'd find in the beginning of the book, with the unfaithful concubine as the unfaithful wife, or the nation who broke covenant with God and then faced the consequences. Well, understanding the concubine as a representative of Israel is possible, but seeing her as a wife is problematic, not least because the text has made such a clear point of not calling her a wife, and Israel is never referred to as God's concubine anywhere else. An even stronger argument, perhaps, is that inevitably it leaves the Levite as representing God. And even if we were to decide she was a whore who deserved her fate, and I don't want to, that would still present God as a cowardly man sacrificing his wife to save his own skin and dignity. It's not a representation I'm comfortable with, or one that sits comfortably within the rest of Scripture. So perhaps we could look at woman as Israel, as the daughter of God. And Ansel argues that actually this is more likely. He says all through the Bible, we see Israel as the daughter of Yahweh rather than the bride. Israel's occasionally referred to as daughter Zion in Zephaniah and Isaiah, for example. Crystal Meyer suggests that there is an implicit father-daughter relationship between God and Israel, evident throughout Isaiah and Jeremiah. But this lens for viewing the story leaves one with questions about the wisdom of the father in handing his daughter over. If God is represented by the father, then why does he hand her over, voiceless, to her husband, who's going to neglect her and all that follows? If it is because, after all, she's been adulterous and this is her punishment, the narrative has gone wrong. If it's about adultery, the bride relationship would be better. Neither of these types are terribly satisfactory. Phyllis Tribble hints at another, which is one that I prefer, and it's one of the concubine being a type of Christ. She writes ironically, saying, her body had been broken and given to many. Lesser power has no woman than this, that her life is laid down by a man. Tribble's intention is to emphasize the powerlessness of the concubine at the hands of her husband, and she definitely doesn't expand the idea of a type. That was me. But it could be argued that both the father and the concubine represent God, God the Father and God the Son. It's perhaps then understandable that the father would send his child, born in Bethlehem, from the security of home to the risks of the outside world, to be at the mercy of ungodly men. We then see that gift rejected, unappreciated, unrecognized, and ultimately sacrificed to save a degenerate man's life, and all without a word. We may run the risk here of shoehorning Jesus into the text, but it's an interesting thought. I wouldn't, however, base a whole sermon on it. It's probably a little too tenuous. A better link to Christ, I believe, is to look to Judges 19 within the broader story of God's people and the longitudinal themes that we can discern within that. It points to a need for a different way of living, a saviour not just for the individuals concerned, but for the whole of their society and ours. It sits within what Christopher Wright describes as the meta-narrative with 6 acts: creation, fall, promise, gospel, mission, and new creation. As a consequence, the key focus of our sermon is to enable the congregation to understand that this story is not some remote tale from ancient times, but actually a part of a story intrinsically entwined with our own. It's a shared story, a story that is linked with our own through Act 4, the Gospel. Wright suggests 4 main reasons why we find a story in the Old Testament, and Judges 19 sits very firmly within his last one to illustrate the consequences of sin and rebellion. Indeed, it could almost be seen as a pinnacle of the consequences of sin and rebellion. Seen as part of a bigger story, the Levite and his concubine live in the time of the promise, but they're living in the reality of the fall, a world without God, a world without hope, a world which desperately needs the gospel. It helps us to understand the gospel as more than our individual salvation. It points to a society and world that needs to be restored and rescued. The Israelite society in the time of the Judges, as well as our own society, struggling with the issues of Me Too. Brian Chappell's fallen condition focus links with the idea of longitudinal themes. He suggests that the key to connecting any biblical text to Christ or redeeming any expository sermon is to determine the fallen condition that necessitated the writing of the passage. Chappell says that it's critical to make the FCF, or the fallen condition, the focus of the sermon and to avoid generalizations. Finding one of these in Judges is somewhat risky. Not many people would readily identify themselves with the Levite, his host, or the men outside in the square. And there's a real danger of alienating the listener by even suggesting that they share a common condition. So this leaves us with a dilemma. Do we simply talk about a world without God, where people do what was right in their own eyes? That's a bit vague. But creating a commonality with the characters is potentially offensive. Finding a focus that is challenging without being so provocative that people switch off is crucial. I'd suggest that the best focus is to demonstrate that without God, we can't be the people we were created to be, And without Christ, we cannot change the abusive cultures that exist in the world around us. Without God and the power of his Holy Spirit, we are slaves to sin. We might like to think we'd never push our spouse or children or even guests into the cold to protect ourselves. But we do struggle to put others' needs before our own. We do struggle with showing selfless hospitality, welcoming strangers into our homes, communities, and even churches. We do struggle to control the desires of our body. We overeat, drink to excess, watch porn, and get into relationships that aren't good or godly because our physical desires control us rather than the other way around. Critically, we struggle to speak up when we see injustice. We might look at this story in horror and say, not me, but actually we deceive ourselves. We every bit as much as the men in this story need the Holy Spirit's power in us to free us from our sin and to live lives that look more like Christ. We need to seek God and spread the gospel with urgency if we're to bring his kingdom to earth and challenge the evil we find in the world around us. So we've connected the story of the Bible to a meta-narrative of God, but we mustn't lose sight of God's reason for putting this story in the canon in the first place. This story warns us of a world without God, but it's a very real story that's been played out thousands of times since this woman had her agency taken away and was handed over to the crowds. The silence of this concubine speaks of the silence of millions of women like her. The narrator's challenge at the end of this chapter, to speak up and do something, cannot change the fate of that concubine, but perhaps can stir us to speak up for the voiceless victims in our society and beyond. You see, globally, 15 million adolescent girls have experienced forced sex, 9 million of those in just the last year. Around the world, 87,000 women were intentionally killed in 2017, more than half by intimate partners. That means that 137 women around the world every single day are killed by somebody who's meant to love them. 1 in 4 women will be the victims of domestic abuse. Our concubine is not alone. She's surrounded by a host of women who were hurt by the people who were meant to love them. So the story of the Levite and his concubine is haunting, and its lesson must surely be never again. The temptation is to turn our back on it because it's too uncomfortable, just as the temptation is to turn our eyes from the evil that still pervades our world. The confusion around the reason for the concubine's early desertion of her husband points to this. Over the centuries, translators found it more comfortable to victim blame her. None of us wants to live in a world where such a terrible thing could happen. We want it to be true that if you're good and you behave, these things simply don't happen to you. And it's meant that the church has turned its eyes too often and too long. Domestic violence has been ignored in the pulpit. Disclosures of abuse have been covered up. The Bible's been misinterpreted and abused to justify abuse. So to preach on Judges 19 is to speak for the woman with no name, to tell of a God whose perfect love casts out fear, who abhors this kind of behaviour, and to turn our face and our hearts towards those men, women and children who live in their own tales of terror today. So, having discerned the focus of the sermon, we're now going to have a look at the style and form, particularly thinking about the pros and cons of a narrative style. So modern communication, books, social media, TVs and dramas mostly employ what we call an inductive approach. It hooks the audience in, waiting to see what will happen. It poses a question that must be answered. The narrative form of preaching sits as a subtype of the inductive. Mark Lowry argues that all sermons should be narrative. He suggests that all preaching is storytelling and that any good sermon, in essence, is a plot in which something is up in the air, an issue not resolved. The preacher's task is to bring the folks home, to resolve matters in the light of the gospel and in the presence of the people, which ties in rather neatly with Chappell's fallen condition focus, because the homiletical bind we find ourselves in is that fallen condition. It's the impossibility of living free of sin without God. Judges 19, I believe, lends itself towards a narrative technique, not just because it is a story, but it's one which demands an investigation. Lowry's movement allows for a discursive, inquiring sermon that can follow the clues the text presents to understand what this Bible passage has to say in the light of the gospel, in the presence of people living in an age of Me Too where domestic violence is far too prevalent. Larry's stages of the homiletical plot give us a really good outline for the sermon. He says the first step in any sermon is to upset the equilibrium of the listeners so you engage them in the sermon theme. Now, I'd say that the bloody packages that you get at the end of the concubine story are perfect for creating that moment. You might have been told that the beginning is a very good place to start, but by actually starting with the last two verses of this chapter, you can set up a police-style investigation of what on earth is going on in Israel. What's this story doing in the Bible, and what does it have to do with us today? These questions would each represent central ambiguities. Larry's second stage is that of analysing the discrepancy. He suggests it should be one of the longest stages as you, the preacher, explore the depth of the problem posed in the introduction. It provides us with the opportunity to go back to the beginning, understanding the narrative that led to the bloody packages, all the while probing the motivations, fears, and felt needs of each of the characters involved. It's important to be rigorous with the questions, to keep returning with more whys until, as Lowry contends, you come across a reason underneath you simply cannot go. And in Judges 19, the whys enable us to examine why the woman is in boxes sent around the country, why her husband dismembered her, why is she dead, why was she abused, why was she not protected, why was she objectified, why had patriarchy come into domination, why had she run away in the first place, why were the men banging on the door in the middle of the night, why was Israel in such a mess? The story enables the preacher to ask these questions with the audience, to explore the answers, to engage with a complicated translation of verse 2, but to end with an understanding that fundamentally the people in Israel are living driven by their desires and their needs, and that is a terrible sight to behold, and it's a terrible place for women to live. All these questions will develop a readiness for resolutions, because at this point we've reached Lowry's aha stage, the one at which there are no more questions, but we're ready for the clues to resolution. It makes sense at this point to reveal that in the time of the judges, we're told Israel had no king and did what was right in its own eyes, and then expand it to show that this tale of terror doesn't represent God's will for the world. Instead, it shows the realities of a world without him. And the aha is achieved by revealing the absence of God and the hopelessness of mankind. It points to the need to understand the difference God's presence in the plot would have made. And that leads us to the next stage, experiencing the gospel, because now we're ready to make the links to Christ. The dating of the story and the motive of the author are almost irrelevant at this point. It doesn't matter which king this story may have been written to promote. The degradation of Israel was not just because it had no king, it was because it did not look to the king. And here the sermon can zoom back out and see the story in the larger narrative of Israel, time and time again, turning away from God, failing to live up to his standards, until God, in his goodness, came to live as one of them, submitted himself to the wickedness of man, and gave his life to restore mankind to him. And the final stage of the sermon is anticipating the consequences. And in this act, we need to be looking at actually what is now possible, what can now be done. So the final call of the men of Israel brings us back and leads us to the answer. But the answer needs to be twofold. Firstly, there is a general challenge to the listener to cease striving to be good, to know their need for Christ and his power in them. But secondly, it is time to cast the congregation's eyes to the oppression of women globally today, to domestic violence, and to consider the part that they could play by giving a voice to women around the world who've been silenced, just like the concubine. And the challenge must be left to speak up and to do something, to understand what that looks like on a macro level, but also on a micro level. How does this affect their conversations with their friends, colleagues, or even with their children? How does it affect them as individuals to, in God's strength, start to change the culture in their spheres? Where do they need to speak up? Where might they need to do something? So in conclusion, a Christocentric approach to the sermon enables it to be a liberating one. The fallen condition enables us to point the story firmly towards Christ. Whilst finding the fallen condition proves complicated, the result's powerful, and it challenges the listener to look beyond their comfortable lives, the realities of a world that is not so different to that of Israel 3,000 years ago, and to question their complicity with the abuse of women around them. The narrative style of preaching leads people on a journey of discovery whose destination is the greatest of news. Judges 19 is not the end of the story, and it does not need to be repeated. There is hope. We live in a time when God's power through the church, his people, can bring redemption, restoration, and peace. It's a story which must be told. It's life-changing, and it should be culture-changing. It's changed my life. When I started to study this story, I was a co-leader in a church. And as I progressed through my dissertation, I had to deal with a number of women who came forward and disclosed abuse, seemingly, coincidentally. It's never a coincidence. And this story demanded that I responded with grace, compassion, and critically belief. This story and my studies mean that when the opportunity came for me to step out of my comfort zone and lead a national charity working to end domestic abuse and equip the church to speak up and do something about it, I took it. And I preached Judges 19 as my final sermon to my church to explain why I was leaving and why I was going where I was. I commented at the time that Judges 19 verse 30 ought to be a fridge magnet, but never would be. And one of my congregation very kindly made me one and sent it to me. I keep it by my desk and it motivates everything I do. And now I use this message to challenge training church leaders and leaders to think through where they may be tempted to dismiss the disclosures and abuses that they see and hear, to challenge them to be bold and brave, to speak up and do something, and to bring light into the darkness, to swing open the closed doors and expose abuse, not cover it up.
Oh, thank you, Becca, so much. You can hear my clap even if you can't hear anyone else's. So well done you. Thank you so much for that excellent paper. As with Lenita, we're going to proceed with about 15 minutes of questions. And after that, we're going to have a bit of a comfort break for about 5 minutes. So if you need to go and get a cup of tea or something, feel free to do so. And then we'll just come together for roughly about 15 minutes for one final panel, then for any last questions. So Holly, take it away, please.
Yep, here I am again to chair the questions. Thanks for your paper, Becca. The first question we've got relates to the earlier part of the paper, where the respondent says, how would you approach readings of the text that claim the concubine got what she deserved?
I would want to delve into, it all stems back to that verse 2 and why she left. Because if she left because the Levite had done something so bad that she left him because she was angry, then she didn't get what she deserved. But actually, of course, it's really important that we don't go so far down that line that we say it's possible to deserve that kind of abuse and rape, because that isn't what the Bible's saying either. So dealing with approaches like that, I'd want to go back and say, why is it so important to you that this is a punishment? Why is it so important to you that we victim blame? Because victim blaming is always about saying, well, actually, we're shifting our responsibility for dealing with abuse like this. It's shifting responsibility from the perpetrator, which has always got to be wrong.
Okay, thank you for that response. We'll move on to the next one. How can we make sure we're avoiding supersessionism in redeeming this text through a Christocentric narrative? Oh, Becky, you're muted, sorry.
Sorry. Sorry, if I may, you might need to translate that question for, because some of us might not know what supersessionism or Christocentric means.
Okay, so this is about making sure that we haven't tried to take a story that meant something else and make it mean something else by imposing, a more modern understanding that comes from a time later on. If I got that right, interrupt me if I've got that wrong.
Only very slightly. It's kind of the whole idea of reading the text by putting Christ in its center. So in that way, later, and the whole supersessionism, as I think Siobhan in the comments noted, is kind of this understanding that Christianity has kind of replaced, superseded the Jewish covenant. So kind of, we are so much better. So, these people were ignorant. We can make it all better. More that kind of reading.
Yeah, okay, so I think that's really helpful. So read me the whole question again, because my brain's just got lost in all of that now.
Okay, I will reread the question. How can we make sure we're avoiding supersessionism in redeeming this text through a Christocentric narrative?
So I think it's really important to really understand that story, when and where it happened, and what was and wasn't going on there. It's important to understand the laws of hospitality that existed at the time, because the truth is, the story as we see it, even if you take Jesus back out of the story and you take, you know, the 3,000 years of history and you go right back and understand it completely in its context, then actually the story doesn't follow the laws of its time. So it wasn't following Israel's laws. It wasn't following Jewish custom. It wasn't Jewish custom to protect men and kick women out of the door. That wasn't the laws of hospitality. That was the laws of hospitality broken. And it's why there's so much confusion about what went on at the beginning of the story with her leaving, because actually it doesn't, there's a lot there that doesn't make sense. So it is very, very important to go back and look at it and think, what was going on 3,000 years ago, without trying to look back and put our new Christian view and try and make it shiny or different, or have criticisms about their rules back then. It's very important to go back and do that. So you look at it, you look at the laws in Deuteronomy about, you know, and actually they're quite, sometimes the laws around adultery and rape sound absolutely barbaric in, you know, in hindsight. But within there's a law that meant that if a man falsely accused his wife, then actually she had some recourse, and she was able to go back and to stand up for herself. And then at that point, he had to take care of her for the rest of his life, and he had to take that into account. And all those stories fit into this story because that's the context in which this is written. And I think that's an important way to go back and take a good look at it.
Great, thanks, Becca. Okay, the next question that I've got on my list is, what do you say to those who say that we should not preach on Judges 19 because it might upset people? It might be better to be dealt with in small groups, as we've heard earlier, so kind of connecting what folks have asked earlier to this discussion now.
I think it's a really good question. It's really similar to the question that Anita got asked earlier about if children are present. And I think it is important to gauge your talks to your audience and to warn them. So a year ago, my church and the vicar of my church was we've been working through Genesis. We've just finally finished last Sunday. But a year ago, we'd got to the story of the rape of Dinah. And which, of course, was a chapter he didn't like. And he said, Becca, I was going to jump it and skip the chapter. He said, and then I remembered you and I thought I'd better not, which was really funny. But he said, how can we go about doing it? And in the end, what we did was we put on it was quite easy because it was lockdown, but we put on an extra service and we put on an extra talk, and we made it optional, but we let everybody know that it was going on, and it created this space to say, we are talking about it. You're very welcome to join us and to be part of this. But actually, if this is a topic that is so traumatic for you that it's too hard to listen to, then don't. And if you've got children in the room, maybe put them to bed before you listen in. So it is about creating those spaces. And I think if I answered the question about having children in the room, it is about being very sensitive to whose ears are listening and talking at their level. But it's really important that we're talking about this with our young people and even with our children in an age appropriate fashion, whether that's, you know, talking about healthy relationships with teenagers and children, about good friendships, about how we treat people with respect and honor and love, boys and girls. You know, all those conversations matter, and it doesn't always have to be here's a sermon on something as brutal as Judges 19, as clearly because there's so many I think it was one of the questions that Anita got asked as well. I'm totally nicking your questions now, Anita, sorry. But there was a question there about how can we do it? Because it doesn't always have to be today we're having a sermon on domestic abuse. It might be we're having a sermon on forgiveness. And within that, we talk about forgiveness isn't the same as reconciliation, because there are some situations, for example, domestic abuse, where actually we might eventually get to a place of forgiveness. That doesn't mean that we have to reconcile a relationship and put ourselves back in danger. You know, we might be talking about submission or there's all manner of things we might be talking about, and domestic abuse becomes almost a sidebar. And yet actually by referencing it, by talking about it, by bringing it into the conversation, then actually it becomes part of our lexicon, it becomes part of the vocabulary, and we're just quietly referring to it all over the place. We see it, we know it, we're talking about it, we recognize it creates, you know, exceptions to rules sometimes, and this is where we go. So I think, yeah, I've totally answered that question and other questions. Sorry, I'll stop talking.
No, we like combined answers. We like lots of things coming into one place. So that's great. And it is helpful to start to kind of bring these connections across the two papers in that way. So folks, there is time if anybody's got one more question to pop it into the chat. I've got one more already lined up. And then of course we'll have a 5-minute break if we can gather some thoughts. And indeed the presenters may have questions for one another through the process that you've already kind of gone through in terms of information we've had so far. The next question is this: can you comment on the parallel between Judges 19 and Genesis 19, thinking perhaps about the links between patriarchy and heteronormativity, particularly around problematic translations that have contributed to homophobic abuse?
Yeah, that's a big question. It's a really big question. There's some people who think the stories are the same story that have been told twice, but that end up looking very different. So I think there's something, but what both stories do is both stories make it look like protecting the man is more important than protecting the woman in a space of wickedness, and women being treated as total objects and not worthy of anything, and both being prepared to be sacrificed. And so actually when you look at that, then it really does feed into a worldview of men being more important than women, and that is the message that's coming through from both of those stories if you don't dig into them and look at what's going on. I think the beauty of the one in Genesis, which you don't get in Judges, is that of course the women get rescued by angels, and they come and they stop it from happening. So that's quite amazing. But actually the way that then has got taken on and used, I have to be honest, I'm not an expert when it comes to, because that isn't I'm going to take Lenita, so that wasn't the focus of my research, was to look at how that then has gone into our understanding of homosexuality, and how that's got used as a term for that, because it wasn't the subject of my research. So if I start going any further, I will simply be waffling.
Okay, thanks, Becca. We've got one more question in the chat. Where can we be trained around domestic abuse in the church so that awareness can grow?
That is a great question. I love that question because that's what we do. So at Restore, that's the focus of what we do now, and we run training at basic level understanding, in like entry level understanding, and a much deeper level, foundation level course for churches to be able to, again, another of Lenita's questions, be able to get some of that understanding in place within the church, so that you are ready to recognise and respond to domestic abuse as and when. And we're developing a church partnership model so that churches can become domestic abuse safe spaces, really, not domestic abuse safe, survivor safe spaces, that they stand against domestic abuse in all its forms, and the whole church gets behind that. So I would recommend looking at restored-uk.org for that one. We've got lots of training running. Anybody can access that. Actually, I've just seen that question pop up. Yeah, that we work across denominations, so we're not Methodist only at all. That's Methodist, Baptist, Salvation Army, Anglican, anybody.
Great, many thanks. That's all of the questions. So I'm going to pass over to Kirsty, who's running the show.
Oh yes, I'm running the show, definitely. Yeah, thank you, Becca, yet again for those the cut paper and the answers, and for Holly for being there to guide us through all these questions.